All right, welcome to part 2 of this video series on data security for Microsoft Copilot for M365. In the last video, you will recall that we looked at the AI shared responsibility model. More specifically, we looked at the data security and compliance parts of Copilot that Microsoft is responsible for. In this video, let's look at the other side of the coin, the parts that the customer is responsible for. To ensure a safe and compliant Copilot adoption, we will look at questions like, what Copilot usage do we deem acceptable or unacceptable? What kind of content should be accessible with Copilot? Can it be used to access sensitive data? What if users start using Copilot in a harmful way? We will discuss these questions and more, but before we begin, I'd like to emphasize two things here. First, if you look at many of the concerns people express around Copilot, let's look here at the customer side as promised. Now, if we look at the concerns that people have with Copilot, then you quickly realize that these are often not technical problems at all, but problems or concerns about how Copilot is actually used. Copilot is, at its core, simply an extension of what a user already does every day. This is crucial to remember. The ones who use Copilot are always people. Hence, the ones who create most of these risks, and subsequently the only ones who can really solve those risks, are also people. Don't look to technology alone to solve issues that stem from human beings accidentally or intentionally misusing that technology. Yes, this video series is predominantly about technical measures we can take to address and monitor risks around Copilot, but always bear in mind that true and complete risk mitigation critically depends on the human element too. You need technical and organizational controls both. So, in your risk strategy, always include things like user awareness, regular trainings, and so forth as well. The second important point involves the nature of the risks we discuss here. A common theme that you will see running throughout this series is that Copilot on its own does not create new risks. However, what it often does is that if there already is a risk, then it can make that risk bigger. This is due to the way it is built. It amplifies existing risks. Or to put it a little differently, the majority of the risks around Copilot are already there, Copilot or no Copilot. So from this, it logically follows that we can't mitigate those risks by just turning a few dials and knobs inside Copilot. We need to look outside Copilot. We need to apply data security and compliance controls to the whole environment. Bear this in mind as we move through this video series, because it will come up a lot. Okay, and now with this long-winded throat clearing out of the way, let's begin our discussion on Copilot data security and compliance with arguably the biggest and most common concern of them all, data overexposure. Or in other words, can Copilot be used to access documents that it's not supposed to? So let's say we have a user here. Can this user use Copilot to use a sensitive document? The typical example that people like to give here is an employee who would like to know, what is my manager's salary? While this scenario sounds scary on paper, it turns out that this can actually be mitigated quite easily. In fact, Microsoft has put in a great deal of care and effort to ensure that Copilot cannot be misused to make data more accessible than it already is. The key safety feature of M365 Copilot in this context is the access model that Microsoft chose for it. In other words, how Copilot accesses data. If you understand just this one thing, then all the mitigations you might have to apply follow intuitively. So, what is Copilot's access model? The answer is also the one that's most logically intuitive. Copilot acts on behalf of the user. What do we mean by that? We return to our drawing from the first video. Recall that when a user prompts Copilot, it subsequently goes into the graph to search for information in the so-called grounding phase. Now, when Copilot does that, it doesn't just have access to everything within the tenant. Instead, Copilot inherits the user's current rights and access permissions. In other words, if at the time the user prompts Copilot has access to a document or another piece of data, then Copilot has access to it too. If the user doesn't have access to something, then neither does Copilot. And this is great because when trying to reason about data overexposure, it allows us to essentially abstract away Copilot from our thinking entirely. We don't need to be concerned about how Copilot interacts with the data, or what exact prompt is used, or what the LLM is doing. We can ignore all of that and simply focus on a much more straightforward data security problem, the access rights of the user. However, this only opens the discussion rather than closing it, because rare indeed is the organization that can confidently claim that its access controls are ironclad. The understandable concern is that some data slipped through the cracks, as it were, and is accessible even when it should be. In such a case, it's entirely possible that nobody noticed before, because the data is, well, not so safely tucked away in some old and forgotten data graveyard that nobody visits anymore. However, since Copilot is specifically designed to be good at reasoning and searching and finding, it's highly likely that it will visit this long forgotten data graveyard. And thus, the data access sins of the past come back to haunt us. The ghost of Christmas past, if you will. However, just like in A Christmas Carol, this ghost haunting us sounds like bad news at first, but is actually good news. Remember what we said before. Copilot is just an extension of what people are already doing. It doesn't create new risks, it only amplifies them. And there is little better example than this one here. The Copilot access model means that if Copilot can find confidential data, then by necessity, humans can do so too. If Copilot has access to something, the user does as well. Even if we decide to bury Copilot and never use it, it's not as if our data risks magically disappear. Let sleeping dogs lie is not a viable option when those dogs are guaranteed to wake up by themselves after all. The past few decades just keep hammering this point home. Unaddressed data risks are getting worse and will continue to do so. Since the amount of data increases exponentially and as search tools and general user familiarity continue to increase, it's pretty much guaranteed that those data sins of the past eventually catch up to us. In fact, many companies have already experienced heavy losses through data leakage incidents way before generative AI was ever a thing to begin with. So the question, do we really have to do this, can be confidently answered with, yes, we really have to do this, whether we like it or not. Now, even knowing this, it's sometimes hard to do something about this. After all, it can be difficult to convince the key stakeholders to invest the necessary time and resources into finally cleaning house and getting data oversharing under control. But now, the introduction of Copilot presents a golden opportunity, what is often called a compelling event, which allows us to hit two birds with one stone, raise awareness and finally tackle those data sins of the past, and secure Copilot in one go. After all, if now is not a good time, when will it ever be? So, with that, where do we start? Luckily, there are many tools readily available to help us. Remember, the key problem we must solve is that sensitive data is more accessible than it should be. Hence, reviewing and properly restricting those accesses is the straightforward way to solve our issue. This means our first step should be to limit and periodically review the accesses to our data, say files, emails, chats, and so forth. in the system that hosts and manages that data. As long as we don't include plugins, referred to the first video, M365 Copilot draws, as the name implies, its data primarily from the M365 environment. So the accesses that are therefore the most crucial to review are Entra ID, what used to be called Azure AD, Exchange or M365 groups, SharePoint, Teams, and OneDrive. Let's take a brief look at each of these with links for more information on them down in the video's description. One common theme you'll notice is that it's usually a good idea to have the owners of a system review who should have access to that system, since they usually know best who really needs access. Let's start with Entra ID. This system controls the tenant's users, as well as their authentication methods, their roles, and their permissions. Since the system is very large and very complex, it helps to split the reviewing responsibilities between the administrators. Let's give the administrator a nice crown here. And the users. At the moment of this recording, Entra ID P2 offers a feature called access reviews, which are helpful in this context since they allow us a structured and automated way to review and manage the users' accesses as well as group memberships. So if you don't know where to start here. Second and related are M365 groups. If you haven't heard of these before, just think of them as groups of users that have shared accesses to resources and other company assets. Here, the responsibility is, again, mostly on the group owners. They should go over the group members and decide whether the members still need to be part of the group or not. In the case of very large groups, we can again recruit the help of the users by periodically asking them to remove themselves from groups they no longer require access to. All of this can again be done with Entra ID access reviews. Then third, SharePoint. As you likely know, SharePoint is a collaboration platform that's divided into sites. Each site has its own access control, granting different levels of access to either individual users or groups of users. Just like in the previous example, the owners of these sites are in the best position to determine user accesses. Therefore, they should periodically review their sites and whether the people who have access to it truly need it. Quite often, SharePoint sites are shared with a huge number of users, sometimes the entire organization, even though the content really only concerns a tiny number of individuals. As in so many other cases in life, less is more here, and there is usually a lot of room for thorough cleanup. Fourth, Microsoft Teams, Microsoft's collaboration and video conferencing application. Since a team where you invite users can hold files, it is again useful to request that the team owners regularly review team memberships and remove those users that don't need access to the team's resources anymore. And finally, OneDrive. This system offers cloud storage to each user, which they can manage on their own. Therefore, the users themselves are the ones who should review accesses to their own files. Fortunately, OneDrive makes it fairly easy to check what files are shared with others. Files that no longer need to be shared should either be made private again or deleted entirely. It is generally good practice to periodically remind users to go over their files and review whom they are shared with. And with this, you hopefully have a good idea of the first steps you can take to ensure a secure Copilot adoption and to minimize the risks of data oversharing. The key is to keep striving for an environment where data is always shared with as few people as possible on a need-to-know basis. This is called the principle of least privilege. If something must be available to all users in the organization, that's fine, but it should be a conscious decision. Otherwise, your data quickly becomes a free-for-all buffet. And with that, we have already reached the end of part 2 of this video series. It may have been a little short, but the one key thing I hope you took away from this is the following. Copilot acts on behalf of the user. Always remember this. It inherits the access rights and permissions of the user. Armed with this knowledge, it logically follows that what you have to focus on is reviewing and controlling those access rights and permissions. And you will have taken big steps to prevent data oversharing. If you're unsure how to start with all of the information I gave you, then my recommendation is start with Entra ID access reviews, if you have them available in your license. After that, it's all about ensuring that the owners of M365 groups, SharePoint sites, and teams regularly review which users have access. Furthermore, make sure that users know where to look up what files they have shared and that they should review this information periodically. Now, as great as this is to prevent data oversharing, this is not the end of the story. I hope you'll join me in the next video where we will talk about a Microsoft tool that is purpose-built to control data accesses and data security and compliance in general, called Microsoft Purview, and how we can use that tool in conjunction with Copilot. I hope to see you there. Bye-bye.